Hello, everyone. We're just going to wait a few more minutes just to see if anyone else is coming in, and then we will get started.
Oh, it's going up. The number's going there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, still letting a few more people in.
Oh, yeah.
All right, I think we are set to get going. So thank you everyone for joining us on our virtual talk today. We ask that you just keep yourself muted throughout this presentation. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat at the bottom of your screen. Our speaker will be happy to address any of the questions or comments at the end of the program. If you're joining us over Facebook Live, we want to say welcome to you as well. You can also ask us questions over Facebook Live. We will be monitoring any comments or questions over there, and we'll make sure to answer them here. Please note that this talk is being recorded and live streamed and will be posted to our social media channels once the talk is over. If you would like to rewatch this talk or watch any previous virtual tours or talks, please check out our YouTube or our Facebook pages. I am excited to introduce our speaker, Bill, to you. His talk is entitled The Golden Age in Spain, and it's bound to be a very exciting and interesting talk. So I'll let you take it away. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. We're going to talk about art in Spain during a period of the Habsburg dynasty. And we're going to first talk about how did that happen? How did the House of Austria end up on the throne of Spain? And the point is that in this period, Spain went, if you've read the introduction, from the most powerful country in Western Europe to, at the end of the 1600s, to a bone of contention between France and Austria. And so we'll, in other words, politically, Spain went down, 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 but culturally went the other way, up, 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 up. And so without further ado, we'll start with a little bit of historical background slide, please. Here we have, we're talking about Spanish Baroque. This slide is shown for one purpose, and that is, what's the difference between Renaissance and Baroque? So, on the left, we have La Belle Jardinière by Raphael, a painting that was based on a Michelangelo arrangement, and the painting is said to have been finished by Ghirlandaio. But in Renaissance painting, the goal is equilibrium, harmony, balance. We have a triangular composition like this, and our eyes are led up the triangle to Mary. On the other side, we have Zurbarán, Madonna and Child with the, in other words, the same subject ostensibly, but look at the difference in the composition. Instead of having harmony, equilibrium, and balance, we have a diagonal. We have a situation it's centered around an event that triggers motion. But very interesting thing, where do our eyes end up? With Mary. I would invite your attention to one other thing. Notice that in Western art, Mary is usually depicted with a red gown and a blue cloak. And here she is. Look, in both cases, she has that. But on the right, we have a Spanish Madonna. Now, this painting by Zurbarán, notice there's a still life on the lower left. There's a little piece of paper or something stuck on the table in the lower left. That's called a cartelino. It's a characteristic of Zurbarán's paintings. There's also a sort of an architectural framework. And with that difference between Renaissance and Baroque, and this remember the diagonal. See if you see diagonal again in the composition of any of the paintings that we look at. Slide, please. Ooh, what's that? The yoke and arrows of Ferdinand and Isabella. Fernando and Isabel, known as the Catholic kings, los Reyes Católicos. Their motto was tanto monta. Montar as a verb means to be important. Tanto means just as much. In other words, something is just as important as the other. And what that means is Isabel was a reigning monarch in her own right. Ferdinand was a reigning monarch on his side. So we have here the arms of Castile and Aragon. Castile, you see the castle in the upper, as you see it, the upper left. The castle of Castile, a lion of Leon, Castilla y Leon. And on the other side, you have the coat of arms of Aragon and Catalonia. So remember, Fernando and Isabel, their symbols are the yoke and the arrows. The symbolism there is at that time, Isabel was spelled with a Y, Y-S-A-B-E-L. The yoke, the Spanish word for yoke begins with, yes, Y, yugo. The arrows are for Fernando because the Spanish word for arrow is flecha, F, Fernando. So remember, tanto monta, they are equal in importance. And we want, and let's start with 1492, Columbus, everybody knows that. The Edict of Expulsion. They signed an Edict of Expulsion. All Jews had to leave Spanish territory. That edict wasn't revoked until 1992. There was a certain amount of celebration for that. Also in 1492, the fall of Granada. Remember, in this year 711, Spain was invaded from North Africa by Berber tribesmen under Arab control. Their leader was Tariq. When they got into Spain, they saw a mountain. The Arabic word for mountain is Jabal. They named it for him Jabal Tariq. We know it as Gibraltar. 711. And it wasn't until 1492, in other words, from 718 on, the Spaniards, the Reconquista, they called it, fighting and fighting and fighting to drive the Moors out of Spain. It finally happened in 1492 with the fall of Granada. The Moorish Sultan, or whatever you want to call him, was allowed to leave. His name was Abu Abdallah. The Spaniards called him Boabdil, and according to the ballads, his whole entourage left Granada. They came to an outcropping, and Boabdil stops and looks back, and his mother was in the entourage. She wasn't where he was. She said, "Why are we stopping? What's going on?" He said, "Oh, your son. He's overcome with emotion and looking back at Granada." And she said, yeah, that's fitting. He cries like a woman over the lands he couldn't defend as a man. But that's not the thing we're going to talk about mainly, though, is their daughters. Everybody knows Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon was married to Henry VIII of England. Catherine had an older sister, Juana de Castilla, known today as Juana la Loca, Joan the Mad. There's a book with that title in the Central Library here in San Diego. Joan the Mad married Philip the Fair, of Duke of Burgundy. His mother was Mary of Burgundy, and she was married to the Holy Roman Emperor. Now that is how the House of Austria got into this picture. Now, slide, please. Here we are, the House of Austria, Charles I of Spain, Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire. Notice he became King of Spain in 1516. He wasn't born in Spain. He didn't speak Spanish, but his mother was a Spanish princess, Juana la Loca. He was elected Holy Roman Emperor in 1519. After all, his grandfather was Maximilian. He was followed on the throne by Philip II. Well, what do we know about Philip II? Felipe II, we might mention while we're at it. Remember, Catherine of Aragon had a daughter, Mary Tudor. Well, what was Mary Tudor to Charles? Well, Mary Tudor was Charles I's cousin. Philip II was her nephew. Think of that. Philip II was Mary Tudor's nephew. Anyway, what do we remember about Philip II? Well, the Invincible Armada, 130 ships set off to invade England. When I was in school, we were taught that the brave English Drake and Hawkins decimated the Armada. They certainly harassed them, but that wasn't exactly what happened. They did capture one Spanish ship that ran aground. Another Spanish ship was blown up by its own gunner who was dissatisfied about something. He lit a slow fuse in the magazine, went over the side, the ship blew up. And then the very indecisive and incapable Duke of Medina Sidonia anchored the whole Spanish fleet off of Calais in France. The English sent fire ships bearing down on them. They had to get underway. The thing got scattered. Then a storm blew them all over and they ended up going all the way around the north, all the way around England, the long way to get back. And the whole event was commemorated by the noted naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison, called the Invincible Armada, or 20,000 colleagues under the sea. That's what we remember Felipe II for, but in Spain, his monument to himself, slide please. There it is, the Escorial. Philip II had this palace monastery built to commemorate a defeat of the French. Remember, his father spent his whole life fighting the French, Protestants, and the Turks. Philip II did the same with not exactly the same results. That's a very large building. It measures 735 feet by 502. It occupies a space of about 8.5 acres. For comparison purposes, you could say, compare it to one side of the Pentagon is over 900 feet. Anyway, it's a very large building. It's El Escorial. It is north of Madrid. The French poet Théophile Gautier wrote a poem about it, and he called it a mad debauch in granite built by Spain's Tiberius. I've heard Philip II called a lot of things. He's called the John Calvin of Catholicism. I'm not sure exactly what the Tiberius thing is about, but anyway, that is Felipe II, Philip II's monument to himself, the Escorial. Slide, please. Spanish literature left us a lot of things. One was, from this period, Don Quixote. This, of course, is a wind farm. And notice the sign, no Don Quixotes allowed. Other famous Spanish writers of the time, one was a poet named Góngora. Góngora has given us a word in English, Góngorism, which means a highly affected literary style. I'm a Spanish major myself. I will confess that Góngora's sonnet to El Greco's tomb, I didn't understand what it said till I saw it in French. But anyway, Góngorism. So we have of Spanish contributions to world literature, Don Quixote, also Don Juan. Remember Don Giovanni by Mozart. This is the original Don Juan was written during this period by Tirso de Molina. That's a pen name. The writer was actually Fray Gabriel Telles. He was a monk. And if you recall from Don Giovanni, everyone remembers the aria, La ci darem la mano. La ci darem la mano, la mi dirà di sì. Well, anyway, Don Juan goes to hell. And you say, well, this is written by a monk. He went to hell not because of all the women whose lives he ruined. He went to hell for taking God's mercy for granted, because his servant kept telling him, you better watch out. You've got to change your ways, because when you die, you're going to have to render account to God. And Don Juan said, tan largo me lo fiáis? Have I got that long? That's why he went to hell. And you may remember the scene from Don Giovanni where he goes to hell in the end. So we have then all of this sort of thing. So now let's get over to the art. We're going to start with El Greco. Nomine Domine Theotokopoulos. None of these prelates can hand you your name. Change it. Sign it El Greco. No, I'm sorry. Change it. Appeal to their Hellenophilia. Sign it El Greco. I'll slap on a frame. Sorry for stumbling there. Now, the reason for showing this is that El Greco was born in Crete. He was trained originally as an icon painter. He went to Venice. Venice controlled Crete at that time, although it was a Greek island. El Greco was a Venetian mannerist by training. He ended up going to Spain. People say that he went to Spain because he hoped to get in on the decoration of the Escorial. There was a Spanish author of the 20th century named Ramon Gomez de la Serra, and I said, oh, come on, people. You know why he went to Spain. He liked bullfighting. Well, that's neither here nor there, but anyway, El Greco, one of his themes was to paint penitent monks? Well, in other words, Jerome, for example, Mary Magdalene, for example. But St. Francis, it was not St. Francis, the normal paintings of him back then were St. Francis receiving the stigmata, or as Nora Sargent used to say, who was a curator of European art back in the last century, with paintings of St. Francis refusing the stigmata. But anyway, the reason for showing this, because El Greco is not Baroque painter, it's a mannerist, but he was the one who had got the idea of depicting St. Francis, in the penitent St. Francis, which is what we have a painting of. But the reason for showing this is that. Slide, please. Another painter in this period, in other words, we think of Spanish painting, we think of El Greco, Ribera, Zurbarán, and Murillo. Jose de Ribera sort of gets second billing a lot because he was born in Spain, he was born in Valencia, but I hope you don't think I have a speech impediment, but I studied art in Spain and the words are pronounced different there. But anyway, Ribera lived in Naples. All right, so Naples was a Spanish possession then. Well, yeah, but he's an Italian. The point for showing this in view of what we have in our collection is simply this. Ribera painted martyrdoms. Zurbarán painted martyrs, but he didn't do this. Now, Ribera was an amazing painter, an amazingly accomplished painter. And there's a physicality about his paintings, and they look very, 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 very realistic. But anyway, as I say, the reason for showing this is just to comment. Zurbarán didn't paint this kind of, he painted martyrs, but not martyrdoms. I don't want to pass over Ribera without commenting about the really amazing painter that he was. Slide, please. Okay, here we are. This is our painting. This is a Temkin painting. Francisco de Zurbarán, St. Francis in Meditation. Remember, St. Francis was not depicted this way until El Greco, in Spain anyway. El Greco came along. So here is our painting by Zurbarán of St. Francis in Meditation with a skull. Now, in addition to Théophile Gautier having written a poem about the Escorial, he also wrote a poem called A Zurbarán. And in that poem, one of the things he says, put that skull back, take that skull back to the charnel house. He was not referring to Franciscan monks, actually. The poem, it's about Zurbarán, but Zurbarán also painted other monks. He was talking about our Carthusians, but anyway, that was mentioned. Now, we also have the next slide, please. Here is another one. Notice this is in the St. Louis Art Museum, but it's the same type of painting. Zurbarán, St. Francis in Meditation. Notice the chiaroscuro. Now, there's something about chiaroscuro that you may have heard this mentioned. There's something, it makes the paintings look more real. It makes the figures stand out and come forward. But the brights are a little too bright and the shadows are too dark to be real. It's almost as if it were painted on the moon. I hope I'm making the point. In other words, the contrast is a little bit unreal. But anyway, the Zurbarán painted a lot of these. We have one. This is another, a painting then of St. Francis in meditation. Now, another painting by Zurbarán, slide. Christ crucified. This, notice where this is in. This is in Seville. Notice the severe chiaroscuro. Notice the sign. Pilate had a sign made. You say, let's have a big sign. Well, I've always thought, well, it had to be kind of big. If anybody was going to read it, it was written in 3 languages: Hebrew, the language of the conquered; Greek, the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean; and in Latin, the language of the conquerors. The sign said Jesus the Nazarene, King of the Jews, in 3 languages. And you can see it there, so it's a fairly large sign. Notice, however, in this depiction of the crucifixion, because the reason for showing this one is to compare it with our crucifixion by Murillo and see the differences. Why is it so dark? Remember the account of the crucifixion. At noon, a darkness came upon the earth. Notice in this crucifixion, the same as the one we have by Murillo, there's no wound in his side. He's not dead. He's still alive. Notice also there are 4 nails. The things look like spikes to me, but they're always referred to as nails. 1 in each hand, 1 in each foot. Traditionally, the number of nails was 3. You say, well, who thought up 4? And the idea about 4 nails was that it was said that people who had received the stigmata later on, that their feet had shown the imprint of the nail head. That's where the idea of 4 nails came from. And that's why it's there. But I want you to remember what this looks like, because it is just being shown to compare it to our painting by Murillo. Now, slide. This is at the San Diego Museum of Art. I think it's suffering from over-cleaning or something, but anyway, this painting is a very famous painting. It's in all the art books that are about Zurbarán have it. Now, this is Western art. In icon painting, it's the names of the people in it are usually written on it. In Western art, no, there's something else. Now, how do we know? Do we by looking at it, or do we have to see the label? Well, what's in there that make it St. Jerome? Well, the lion is one thing, and that cardinal's hat is another. Those are attributes, as we say, of St. Jerome. I hope you can see there's a diagonal here. A diagonal pointing to the trumpet of the last judgment. You see the trumpet there in the upper left, as I see it. St. Jerome, the handling of colors. Zurbarán was said he could do whites, this crisp as snow, as white as milk, and as heavy as cream. You can see some of that here. And the cardinal's hat, he said, wait a minute, wait, they didn't even have cardinals then. Yeah. They said, yeah, but he would have been a cardinal if there'd been such a thing. But anyway, that's one of his attributes. A cardinal's hat and the lion, sort of a Androcles and the lion type story. And then we would not be complete with Zurbarán if we did not mention another series of paintings that he did. Now remember, Zurbarán, as a painter, he was in turn famous and forgotten. He was known in 17th century Spain and well into the 18th century in South America. And his discovery outside of Spain was due to French generals in the Napoleonic Wars who stole the paintings. The Romantics liked his work, but then after about 1853, he was all but neglected, except by some art historians. And today he ranks as a great Baroque painter, the foremost Spanish religious painter in the 17th century, with monuments of grave faith, rock-like, unsentimental devotion. In other words, to go back to the Escorial, Unamuno, a writer in the early 20th century, its austere simplicity. Unamuno called it the architectural nude, but I say it to a certain extent, this simplicity is like Zurbarán, unsentimental devotion. Murillo is sentimental, but not Zurbarán. Unsentimental devotion, simplicity. His figures are solidly modeled. He uses deep colors, tenebroso lighting, single standing figures, a fusion between medieval and Baroque. Paul Guinard referred to these paintings of the Carthusians as a symphony in white major, symphonie en blanc majeur. He excelled in precise draftsmanship, a blend of realism and mysticism. But we want to stress this thing: unsentimental devotion, simplicity, manly faith, ascetic simplicity like the Escorial, disciplined order. However, and speaking of Zurbarán, a group of paintings in which the figures adopt a posture described as processional merits comment. Virgin martyrs in contemporary dress. And that's not Zurbarán's forte, you might say. But they offer contrast to his sober monumental style. And it's one to which he devoted a great deal of time and attention. They're clothed in richly variegated robes. Slide, please. We may as well get to them. There she is, St. Margaret. They're clothed in richly variegated robes, deriving usually from Italian or Flemish models. However, this is St. Margaret in the National Gallery in London. I will admit, I nearly fainted when I saw this painting for the first time. However, we talk about how they were dressed in richly variegated robes. No, not St. Margaret. St. Margaret is painted in a prettified version of a la campesina. Campesina is the peasant woman, so a la campesina, she was a shepherdess. She's holding a shepherd's crook. But it's a prettified version. Look at her necklace of coral and jet, the delicately frilled collar and cuffs. They don't suggest tending to sheep at all. And the straw hat in particular, with its sweeping broad brim. That's a humble version of the headgear worn by Spanish noblewomen for an outing in the countryside. St. Margaret of Antioch with the dragon in the background, part of the legend of hers that the dragon tried to swallow her, but she made the sign of the cross and the dragon was defeated. It's a very, very beautiful painting. And for contrast, there is one more. Slide, please. Look at that. That is Santa Casilda de Toledo, talking about the richly variegated robes deriving from Italian and Flemish models usually. This is Santa Casilda, Saint Casilda of Toledo. And so what is her story? Her father was the emir or the sultan or whatever in Seville, or no, Toledo, I'm sorry. Santa Casilda de Toledo. He was a Moorish ruler of Toledo way back. She had felt pity for his Christian captives who were held in a dungeon and used to take bread to them hidden in the folds of her skirt. However, once her father caught her doing that, he said, "What are you doing? What have you got in that skirt? Show me." She said, "Roses." And she opened her skirt, and there you can see the roses. In other words, the bread that she was taking to the captives was miraculously turned into roses. And there she is. That's one of a sideline of Zurbarán, if you wish, but his virgin martyrs. Now, to my knowledge, Santa Casilda was not a martyr. She, after this episode, became ill, did not want to be treated by Muslim doctors, and she then went north, was cured, and became a hermit. Became Christian, was baptized, became a Christian, and lived a life as a hermit. But anyway, that is another aspect of Zurbarán's paintings, my favorite. Of course, my favorite painting by him is the St. Margaret. This is Santa Casilda. He painted this several times also. Slide, please. Now, here we go, back to the Temkin. This is, now, the painter is Bartolomé Esteban Murillo. And, you know, Spanish names, typically there's your given name, then your father's family name, then your mother's family name. If I were named a Spanish way, my name would be William Hardin Swink. Well, and Murillo, it's a real funny thing. Bartolomé Esteban Murillo. In other words, the E stands for Esteban, which to us looks like the word for Stephen. I don't understand exactly why most people who see Esteban written pronounce it Esteban. I don't understand that because the stress is on the same syllable as in English, Stephen, Esteban. But the thing about Murillo is Esteban was his father's family name. You say, oh, Murillo was his mother's name? No, Murillo was his grandmother's name on his mother's side. Say, oh, come on, what? You just said that. Well, you come across this in Spanish art. Look at Picasso, for example. Picasso's name was Pablo Ruiz Picasso. Ruiz was his father's family name. Ruiz is a real common name, so he took his mother's family name. Although Picasso actually signed some of his early paintings, Pablo Ruiz Picasso, they dropped the Ruiz. And Murillo, the one we call Murillo now, his mother's name was Pérez Murillo. In other words, his mother's father's name was Pérez. It's a very common name, so she used Murillo instead. So Murillo is his grandmother's name. But anyway, Bartolome Esteban Murillo, Christ on the cross. This is the same vision, the same version that we saw painted by Zurbarán, but notice the difference. One difference is the sign's a lot smaller. We'll get back to that. Don't let me forget it. I've been called a lot of things, but one thing is I'm somewhat disorganized. But anyway, notice how is this similar to the Zurbarán and how is it different? Where was Christ crucified? He was crucified on a bare hill called Golgotha. That's not a Hebrew name, that's an Aramaic name, but it means the place of the skull. See the skull there. Legend has it that Adam was buried there. So here we have Christ on the cross, but notice how many nails. 3. The Zurbarán had 4. There is a famous crucifixion by Velázquez that has 4, but Murillo goes back to the traditional 3. Notice his side isn't pierced. He's not dead. He's looking up. Notice how, now, this is going to sound silly. It sounds silly to me even, but would you concede that compared to the Zurbarán, this is more sentimental? I'm not sure if people see it that way, but to me, that Murillo is a sentimental type painter. And I'm going to contradict myself a little bit later because I'm going to talk about another kind of, in other words, look at Murillo. Murillo is famous today for his Immaculate Conceptions and for his genre paintings of street children. That's what he's famous for today. Zurbarán is famous for monks. I have an art history book written in Dutch. I was reading about Zurbarán. It just looked funny to me. It described, it said he's the painter of boetende, biddende monniken. And I said, boetende, biddende, it just looks funny to me. Biddende, of course, means, praying. But boetende, I don't know, what does that mean? It means penitent. But anyway, Zurbarán is very austere and simple and plain. Notice the chiaroscuro here is just enough to give shape to the, but it's not like the Zurbarán. Okay, now one more thing. The sign. It's a very, now I don't know why, but notice the sign. So what about the sign? What do you mean? Well, it's smaller. Well, all right, smaller. So what? Well, one reason it's smaller is that the Greek is all abbreviated. The Latin part is partly abbreviated, but it's the Hebrew part. And I don't know how it got that way, but what did the sign say? The sign said, Pilate wanted everybody to know why he was up there hanging on the cross. Jesus the Nazarene. Now, in English, we say of Nazareth, but I'm saying that the 3 languages that's written in say the Nazarene. Jesus the Nazarene, King of the Jews. Now, in this painting, and you can see this painting, this painting's on the wall in the Timken. It doesn't say that. What doesn't say what? The Hebrew doesn't say that. Doesn't say what? It doesn't say king. It says something else. Now, did someone come along later and mess with it? I don't have any idea. All I know is that instead of saying King of the Jews, it says Light. The Hebrew is not abbreviated, it's written out, but the other parts are, and that's why the sign is small. So, remember the differences. These are both paintings from the same period. Murillo, you do not need to take my opinion, but I say that to me, the Murillo is a more sentimental rendering than the one by Zurbarán. This is unorganized me looking for notes. Now, the slide, please. As we said, nowadays, Murillo is famous for his renderings of the Immaculate Conception. I want to invite your attention to two things. At the very beginning, we noted that Mary was clothed. She's wearing a red gown and a blue cloak. We had two paintings of the Madonna, and both of them were like that. Look at this. It's blue and white, no red. One reason for mentioning that is that in the San Diego Museum, there is a Goya painting of a Spanish general in full dress, as the Germans say, in gala mit hohen Orden. In other words, full dress with medals. He's wearing a sash, and the sash is blue, white, blue. Who is the patron? That means that he's a member of the Order of Charles III. Charles III was a Bourbon king in Spain. Following, in other words, after the last Habsburg died, there was a war, the War of the Spanish Succession. A Bourbon king came on the throne. There was a war about that. During that war in the early 1700s, the British took Gibraltar. They're still there. That's why the British are in Gibraltar. The Spanish want them to leave. But anyway, the Order of Charles III, their patroness is the Immaculate Conception. That's why his sash is blue, white, blue. Now, two more things. What is that she's standing on? Now, Immaculate Conceptions are like that. Like what? Well, what is she doing? Well, she's standing on the moon. Okay, well, that comes from the book of Revelation, chapter 12. She's described that way. Now, one more thing. Diagonal. Anyone see it? The diagonal in this painting goes up. You get that? I hope you get that impression from it. It gives this motion upward. Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception. Remember, that is more, and in this particular painting, it's a very large painting. For Murillo anyway, the chiaroscuro is a little stronger. than usual. And you have this procession, and it's this escort of cherubs. Okay, one more slide. Niños comiendo de una tartera. Now, this is Murillo. Remember, we said Murillo is famous for his Madonnas of the Immaculate Conception and for his paintings, genre scenes of poor children. Now, I was going to make a statement. I usually give these talks in person. I would ask for your opinion. Do you agree with this? But the comments are about this kind of, remember, he's famous for two things now, especially in Spain, his Immaculate Conceptions and these genre paintings. They typically have two children. Notice there's a dog. The dog, of course, is patient for a dog, I would say, waiting for someone to give him something to eat. But anyway, they are brimming with vitality. These poor children are enjoying what life has to offer. The distinctive trait, now see if you believe this, the distinctive trait is not poverty, but charm. Not poverty, but charm. Also, these paintings usually do not strike a pathetic note. I wonder if you agree. But anyway, that's a very interesting thing. Murillo is famous for this kind of painting. We don't have any here, but anyway, they are somewhat, and as I say, I would ask the audience if you agree with this, they are somewhat idealized, poorly dressed and shod, of course, ragged attire, not particularly naturalistic, but it does capture the behavior of children. And there's the dog, a frequent companion, hoping to get a morsel. I've kept you long enough. Thank you very much I hope you didn't stop listening before I stopped talking. But anyway, thank you very much for your kind attention. And I will, if I can answer questions, I will. So usually I don't know, I can't answer them, but I'll give it a try if there are any questions.
Well, thank you, Bill, for this wonderful presentation. And yes, if anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute or type it right in the chat.
I would like to know if anybody agrees with the evaluation of this particular niños comiendo de una tartera. Does it strike a note of pity or not, or is it just charming? Murillo his paintings are charming and sentimental. I mean, even his crucifixion is at least compared to Zurbarán. It's sentimental and charming. And I'm sorry. Go ahead. Is there a question? Okay.
No,
It looks
hi.
like Peggy was raising her hand. Peggy, go ahead.
Yes, Penny.
Penny.
No, I absolutely agree with you. I have, if this does not strike pity or concern for these children, to me, they are charming. The painting is charming. They almost have a storybook quality. If this was in a book form and this was a picture, I would be happy reading to a child. If this was his intent, then he certainly succeeded. If his intent was to inspire concern for poor children in ragged clothing with possibly not enough to eat, he did not he did not do what he wanted to do. It's a
Right,
it's a charming
I-
picture. That's it. So yes, I agree with you.
thank you. It's a Murillo painting. I mean, Murillo, it's sentimental and charming rather than austere and severe and serious. Even I mean, his Madonnas are that way too. If you could see an Immaculate Conception by Ribera, you get an entirely different impression from it. At least I do.
And also the bright light on the left side of the painting behind one of the boy who was about to enjoy that morsel of food. It has to me, it has a very uplifting, positive mood to it. So that adds to the painting, looking at them from a positive point of view rather than the painting eliciting any sympathy or concern for them.
Oh, yes. Thank you very much for the comment. I was really interested to see if anybody agreed with that. Now, it's not supposed to feel sorry for them. It's just children doing what children do, enjoying what life has to offer.
Mhm.
And the bright light, of course, enhances the chiaroscuro to bring out the forms.
Mhm.
All righty, if there's no other questions, we want to just thank you guys once again for joining us today. We hope you guys can join us again next Thursday for another one of these lectures. This one will be about the Flemish school and the artists active in Flanders during the 15th and 16th century. And then once again, thank you to Bill for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you.